Hi, I'm Pastor Kerry. As we go through life, we have our highs and we have our lows. Sometimes we're on the mountaintop, and sometimes we are way down in the bottom of the valley. I want you to think for a minute about your life, and I want you to think about a time when you were really going through a tough experience. And I don't necessarily want to know what it was, but I just want you to kind of picture that low moment in your mind. And if I had asked you, as you were going through that difficult time, how you felt about God, I wonder what you would have told me as you were going through that valley. The reason I bring that up is because this Sunday, our lectionary passage for August 15th, 2021, is the 34th Psalm. And this psalm was written as David was going through a really, really tough period in his life. I want to give you the background for this psalm. Now, you know that David, when he was very, very young, that Samuel came and identified him as the next king of Israel. And after that, it seemed like he just led a charmed existence. Pretty soon, he became the armor bearer for King Saul, the king that he was going to replace. He defeated Goliath. He became best friends with King Saul's son Jonathan. He even married King Saul's daughter Michal. But not long after all of these very positive things happened for David, things started going really bad for Saul. And Saul turned on David, to the point where he was actually trying to kill David, and David had to go on the run. At one point, while David was on the run, he had to go to the high priest and say, "Hey, I am starving. Is there anything you can give me to eat?" And the high priest said to him, "Well, David, I've got the showbread, but that's holy bread. It's meant to stay on the altar. It's not meant for you to eat. Even us priests, we can't eat that until after it's been on the altar for a week." And David said, "I'm starving. Is there any way?" And so the high priest made an exception and allowed David to eat the showbread, the holy consecrated bread on the altar. And then, after that, David found himself on the run once again. He was now in Philistine territory. You know, of course, that the Philistines were the mortal enemies of the Hebrews. The Philistines found out that David was there. They had heard that he was going to be the next king of Israel. David's reputation preceded him. And so they wanted to capture him. And so David, realizing that he was in huge trouble now, he decided to act like a crazy person. And so he started behaving in completely bizarre ways. I know this is going to sound kind of gross, but one of the things that David actually did was he actually slobbered all over himself so that they would think that he was completely out of his mind. And it worked. They saw this crazy slobbering man, and they said, "That's the next king of Israel, let him go." But David, at this point, things have gone great, 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 and then all of a sudden they are going bad, bad, bad. And so, this is the point at which David writes Psalm 34. And if you're wondering, well, Pastor Kerry, how do we know that? How do we know that that was the exact moment that he wrote Psalm 34? Well, the reason we know that is because it tells us right here in the title of the psalm. It says, Psalm 34 of David, when he pretended to be insane before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he left. So this is the exact moment that David wrote the psalm. So knowing that David was at this really, really low moment in his life, what did he say about God? Let's find out. This is Psalm 34. It's a slightly abridged version of the psalm. I wanted to get it down to kind of a manageable length. So, starting with verse 1. David says, "I will extol the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. I will glory in the Lord. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. Glorify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. Whoever of you loves life and desires to see many good days, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from telling lies. Turn from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their cry. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. The righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all. The Lord will rescue his servants. No one who takes refuge in him will be condemned. May God bless the reading of the word. So, for a guy who was at what was probably the lowest moment of his entire life so far, he actually seems to have some pretty positive things to say about God. And so let's do what we always do. Let's talk through the psalm. There are just a few items in here that I want to put a little bit finer point on. And then after we talk through the psalm, we'll talk about the truths that this psalm reveals to us about God. So, at the very start of the psalm, David has got nothing but good things to say about God. Even though David was at this incredibly low point in his life, David says, I'll extol the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. I glory in the Lord. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. Glorify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. So, I think that is a testament to the unshakable faith that David had in God at this point in his life. Then in the second stanza, starting with verse 4, David goes on and says, God will take care of me. God will take care of all of us. David says something in verse 7 that is very interesting. He says, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. Now, friends, just as kind of a side tangent, you know, of course, that there are many people out there who like to think that we have guardian angels. And I will be the first to say that there are a handful, not a lot, but there are a handful of verses in the Bible that kind of contribute to this idea of guardian angels. And this is one of those verses that probably contributes to the idea of guardian angels. Now, based on this verse and even based on the other verses that we find in the Bible, am I telling you that you have a guardian angel and that I have a guardian angel? Well, I don't know. I don't know if I would go that far. I think it would be safer for us to say that children have guardian angels. There is a verse in the New Testament that is a little more direct about that. For the rest of us, it would be neat to think so. Maybe we do. Hopefully we do. But based on Psalm 34:7, I'm not going to say that's an absolute truth. So, anyway, thanks for letting me go on that side tangent. Now, right after that, verse 8 is probably the most well-known verse in this entire psalm. If there's one phrase from this psalm that you had heard before, this is probably it, where David says, taste and see that the Lord is good. And usually when you think about the senses with which we experience God, you probably don't always think of your sense of taste as a way in which we experience God. Some of you might say, well, Pastor Kerry, I experience God every Sunday morning or once a month or once a quarter or once a year when I partake of communion. And that's a very good point. But I would also point out to you that in the Old Testament, they didn't have communion. And I think it might be possible that David was saying, taste and see the Lord is good, because he had just had this experience where he had tasted the holy bread, the showbread from the altar, the bread that no one was supposed to eat, but the high priest made an exception for David in that case. And David, maybe for the first time in his life, as he tasted that holy consecrated bread, maybe he felt like he was tasting just a bit of what the Lord is like, of what God is like. So, anyhow, David says, taste and see, and then he talks about, look, if you love your life, these are the things that you need to do so that you'll have a blessed life. We're going to come back and talk more about that here in just a couple of minutes. Then in verse 15, David says, the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, his ears are attentive to their cry. And like I said, David is writing this psalm at a very low moment in his life. I almost feel like at the start of the psalm, it almost seems like David is kind of pretending that he doesn't have all of the troubles that he was experiencing at that particular moment. But I wonder if here at the end of the psalm, David finally starts to admit to himself, to God, maybe even admit to us as he writes this psalm, that he did have troubles. Because at the end of the psalm, starting with verse 17, David says, the righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. The righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all. The Lord will rescue his servants. No one who takes refuge in him will be condemned. And you can't help but think that maybe David was talking about himself there at the end of Psalm 34. So, that is the 34th Psalm. One other thing that I would point out to you is that this psalm is exactly 22 verses long. I realize we skipped a couple of those verses, but this psalm has 22 verses. It also just so happens that the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters. And you might recall that 3 weeks ago, I told you that Psalm 145 was an acrostic psalm. It was one of a handful of acrostic psalms written by David. Well, this is another acrostic psalm written by David. Very, very interesting. So, let's do this now. Let's talk about the truths that this psalm reveals to us about God. And the first truth is this: God is honored when we worship together. God is honored when we worship together. Again, in Psalm 34, verse 3, David says, glorify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. And so David is saying that worshiping God is something that we are supposed to do together. And I've met many people over the course of my life that have said to me, Pastor Kerry, I experience God when I'm out in nature. It's when I am in the great outdoors that I have my time of worship with God. And friends, I'm not disputing that. I would say that I've experienced that myself. There have been many times over the course of my life when I've been out in nature. I can think of times when I was up in the mountains in New Mexico, when I was in the Grand Canyon in Arizona, when I felt like I was out there by myself and in the middle of God's beautiful creation, I was worshiping. So, anyone who feels that way, that's perfectly fine. But I also want you to understand that throughout the Old Testament and throughout the New Testament, the Bible from cover to cover, from Genesis to Revelation, tells us that as believers, we are supposed to worship together. And that's one of the things that made the pandemic over the past year and a half so difficult for so many believers, is that we weren't able to come together and worship. And I realize that for many of you that are watching this video right now, that you aren't able to get out of your house. That's the reason you're watching this video. And God bless you. Thank you for continuing to worship. This is probably one of the best ways that you can continue to worship. But for those of you who may be watching this video and you are able to get to church, the Bible says the best way for us to worship is when we worship together. So that is the first truth this passage reveals to us. The second truth is this: God will bless those who do what is right. God will bless those who do what is right. Now, the place where we find that in this psalm is right after David says, taste and see that the Lord is good. David says in verse 12, whoever of you loves life and desires to see many good days, he says, you need to do 4 things. He says you need to keep your tongue from evil. You need to keep your lips from telling lies. You need to turn from evil and do good. You need to seek peace and pursue it. If you do those things, God will bless you. Now, I know you're thinking to yourself right now, Pastor Kerry, I know that. You're telling me something that is incredibly obvious. You don't need to tell me that God will bless those who do what is right. But the reason that I think that's worth mentioning here is because a lot of times when we are at one of those low moments in our lives, sometimes when we find ourselves mired down in the bottom of the valley, I know that for myself anyway, maybe it's not true for you, but I know that for myself, a lot of times when I feel like everything is going wrong, then it's a lot easier for me to do what's wrong. When I feel like maybe God isn't helping me, and I know that sounds incredibly selfish, and it is incredibly selfish, obviously, but sometimes when I feel like, well, everything's going wrong anyway, I might as well do things that are wrong. And the point that I think this passage makes for us is even when we're down in the valley, we have to keep trying to do what's right. We're never going to be perfect. You're never going to do everything right. I'm never going to do everything right. But we can't just give up. We can't just stop trying to do what's right when we're going through tough times. Even in the middle of those tough times, we have to keep trying to do what's right, because God will bless us if we do. That is the second truth we should take from this passage. And the third truth we should take from this passage is this: God will rescue and deliver those who are righteous. God will rescue and deliver those who are righteous. Again, at the end of the psalm, David, who was probably thinking of himself, whether consciously or unconsciously, David was probably thinking of and talking about himself at this point. David says, "The righteous cry out, and God hears them. God delivers them from all their troubles. God is close to the brokenhearted. God saves those who are crushed in spirit. Those of us who are righteous, we may have many troubles, but God will deliver us from them all." And that is perhaps the most encouraging thing that we should take away from this psalm. And take away from an author who is going through a really tough time, probably for the first time in his life. He was going through one of the lowest moments, and yet he was able to say, "Bless the Lord. Come worship God with me. Do what is right. Taste and see that the Lord is good. And trust that God will rescue and redeem those who are righteous." So, my friend, if you're going through a tough time in your life right now, hang in there. Please, persevere. Know that God sees you, and that God is with you, and that God is going to see you through. Let's close with prayer. God, we thank you for your encouraging words today, spoken through King David in the Old Testament. I pray that you would help whoever is out there struggling right now, help them to be encouraged by David's words when David was struggling. Help us all to keep our eyes on you and know that you will see us through. Amen. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you again next week.